Hey everybody, Periscopers. We're going to try this rotating the camera thing again because apparently it worked okay last time. Sorry I'm late with this. As I posted on Tuesday, I had stuff ready. I was working on it, but kind of ran out of time and wasn't really able to get a chance to post it on Tuesday. And then this has been a crazy week because if you notice, I'm not in my office. I'm not in front of the Wesley Center. I'm at Camp Johnston Woods, which is where we're having our fall retreat this week. So I've been kind of busy with weekly stuff and then trying to get things ready for that. Let me give you a tour real quick. So if you live in the area of southeast Tennessee and you need a good place for a retreat, Johnston Woods is incredible. I'm going to turn the camera around and let you look. As you can see, it's a nice wooded area. It's a great retreat center. The main meeting hall is awesome. I'm just going to give you a look at the porches and the outside of the building. So you can see it's a nice place. So if you need some place to go for a retreat, you got a good group size. They do weddings here, so maybe I'll try to link you up with the actual their actual website later on. That might be helpful. But anyway, let me scoot in. I'm trying to use my bag as a tripod, but it's not working really well. So anyway, one of the other reasons that kind of held me up on this is that this is the big section of text that covers a lot of ideas, and I'm trying to deal with all those ideas. And actually, if you come to the Bible study on Tuesdays, I don't have time to go as in-depth as I do on these videos because I'm doing it for students who have like about an hour in between classes, and so we just fit it in as we can. So on these videos, I go into a lot more detail, and so that's kind of why they run a little bit longer too. Anyway, so let's get into it. If you notice my hat, can you see my hat? What does that say? All right. If you know what that hat is all about, comment and tell me what you think the H and the date refers to. And if you get it right, not wrong, but if you get it right, I might get in contact with you and send you a free Wesley Center t-shirt, which would be kind of cool. Anyway, so I'm going to get a drink of water first, and then we're going to dive right in. So anyway, so this week we're visiting the second lesson in Mitzi Miner's Bible study out of the pastor's Bible study on the Gospel of Mark. And this week we're covering, session 2 rather, covers Mark chapter 2 verse 1 through chapter 3 verse 6. And Mitzi titles it Conflict Over the Kingdom of God. And that's a good word for it, conflict. So let's dive right in. Conflict and challenge in a shame-honor culture. I don't know if we don't really use the term shame and honor very much anymore. You can tell that by looking at the media and the current political climate and the way things are being handled by everyone. If you get on social media, you see there's a lot of people who don't seem to have much shame anymore about things. And that's just kind of the way it is. I'm going to have to slowly move my bag and try to find the best position because the sun's going down, it's moving and bleaching out the camera. Anyway, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of shame. A lot of people defend their honor or get worried about honor. Nobody likes being dissed. Don't go dissing people. But let's talk about this idea of this shame-honor culture. Mitzi Miner references a guy by the name of Bruce Molina. And if you've not heard his name, that's not surprising. He's a specialist, right? He teaches people who go to seminary, and he specializes in the socioanthropology of first-century Judaism because lots of people want to know about that. Anyway, but this is his book. Can you see it? It's called The New Testament World, and It's a good book. It's actually a very important book. I have it because I had to in seminary, but it's one of those books where I was smart enough, thankfully, in the day not to get rid of it. And I've gone back and read through it a couple of times since then. See, look. If Joel Green ever happens to watch this, he's the one who made me buy this. Look, I still have the book, and I still read it, and I still use it. So anyway, but Bruce Molina talks about the idea of a limited good society, and in a limited, it's the idea that, well, let's talk about good. What do we mean when we talk about goods? We talk about a lot of things being good, right? Chocolate ice cream's good. That's what I always say. And if you look at me, you can tell I believe it. But we talk about goods, things as goods, but there are lots of goods, right? There are things that we see as good because they have a positive impact on our life, right? And those things we tend to treat like commodities, right? So, if somebody's in the marketplace and they're talking about goods, they might talk about like a commodity like oil or grain or things like that. It's things that you can trade, things that have value in a culture, in a society, in an economic culture. Well, Bruce Molina talks about in the first century Judaism, you have a limited good society. And please, by the way, if you don't like what I'm saying about this and you think this makes no sense, don't blame Bruce Molina. Please don't. It's not his fault. It's probably mine. Anyway, in a limited good society, you have things that have value like any commodity would, but they're things like honor. Honor is a commodity in a limited good society like Bruce Molina is talking about in the time of Jesus. It's the idea that there's only so much to go around. Just like in our society, the goods that we trade on it with economic value, there's only so much of it to go around. That's why gas and oil has value. There's only so much of it, increasingly less of it. Somebody has to go get it. Somebody has to process it. Somebody has to put all the work into it, and that gives it more value. So in Jesus' time, honor was a limited good. There was only so much of it to go around. So basically, if you want it, there's a little bit of it, and you got to figure out how to get it. Molina says, honor, like all other goods in first century Mediterranean society, is a limited good. There is only so much to go around, or at least that is what people learn to perceive. And let's talk about that. Think about that and remember it. This idea that we learn what has value, right? We learn how to perceive what has value. Now, that doesn't mean that what we perceive as having value does have value or is right. But that's how we learn things. We learn what the culture values and what it doesn't value. That's going to be important later on. So people learned to see that honor had this great value, and there's only so much of it to go around, and you had to fight for it, and you had to defend it. So how do you get honor, right? Molina goes into talking about how honor can either be ascribed to a person or acquired. So let's talk about what it means to have honor ascribed to you. So ascribed honor, he says, this is Molina's words, ascribed honor, like ascribed wealth, is honor that you get simply for being you, not because of anything you do to acquire it. In other words, he goes on to say, being born into an honorable family makes one honorable, right? Your honor at that point doesn't have as much to do with you or who you are or what you've done as it has to do with who your parents are or who your grandparents were or your great-great-great-grandparents. That's how you get honor. Another way you can have honor ascribed to you is, Molina says, honor can also be ascribed to a person by a notable person of power. So, for instance, last week we talked about the relationship of Caesar to somebody like Herod, right? Herod has honor ascribed to him by this person above him who is named Caesar. Caesar, because of who he is, has lots and lots of honor and power and everything else. He can disseminate some of that to people who please him and kind of make his life easier, as long as they make his life easier. So Herod ascribes power to Caesar ascribes power to Herod. Herod ascribes it to the people under him on down the line. So on and so forth. So That's ascribed honor. Acquired honor. Basically, you got to take honor from another person. That's how you get acquired honor. And this always happens in a public realm, a social realm. And in the first century Mediterranean, as Molina says, now in the first century Mediterranean world, every social interaction that takes place outside of one's family or outside of one's circle of friends is perceived as a challenge to honor, a mutual attempt to acquire honor from one's social equal. So, in other words, anytime you're out in the marketplace or you're out in the town square or something and you run into other people that, mainly people who you perceive as equals, you challenge them. You do things to challenge their honor, and if they fail, you get honor that way. So, but this is interesting, though, because we talk about this, I'm talking about it, and I keep referencing first century Judaism. And I keep saying that, this is how it was in the first century. But if you really listen to what Molina's saying about honor and good and this idea of a limited good society, there's only so much of it to go around, and you have to get it from somebody else somehow, that sounds an awful lot like our culture today. We have a limited good society. It's really, I would say, no different. We probably aren't that different from our first century ancestors. We still have ascribed honor. It's all about who you know, who you associate with, what group you belong to, power by association. Let's see, this book here is great, by the way. If you've never read this book, you should get it. Especially you college people and other young adults who are new to the workplace. This is a good book. It's got a lot of good ideas, and I think if you read it, you'll understand probably how your work culture operates and how people understand who they are and what kind of power they have. But Hagberg talks about power by association. It's what kind of power you have in a system or any kind of culture, any kind of institution, any organization. Depends on who you know. And there's people, that's how they think. That's how they operate. It's their power is whether or not everybody else perceives it this way, they perceive their power as being based on who they know and who they associate with. And like I said, many of our systems and institutions still work this way. You see it in politics, the question all the time, well, if I'm seen with so-and-so, what will the voters think? Or if I'm with these people, what will the voters do? And what will the polls say? How will that reflect in the polls? Business associations. We've got things like LinkedIn, where it's all about networking and all about getting endorsements, whether or not anybody really looks at it or cares about it. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. You can look me up if you want. I'd never go on it, so don't, if I don't respond and accept your LinkedIn request right away, it's nothing personal. Just I get on there like maybe once a year. But, I'm not really convinced that even LinkedIn does anything really good. Sad to say, even the church is affected by this. This idea, it's kind of like, pastors looking to connect, which, anyway. But what are they looking to connect with? They're looking to connect with power in and out of the church. You'll see church leaders that'll just get all really excited about the possibility of linking up with political leaders, which is kind of scary to me personally. It may not be that scary to you, but it bothers me. But they want to link up with power. They want to link up with prestige. Once again, it's who's in and who's out. It's this idea, especially in the church, when it comes down to ascribed power and honor. It's all about who you associate with. If you can't actually have honor, if you can't actually have power, well, at least maybe you can sit next to it at annual conference. So, anyway, moving on. We still have acquired honor. We've got ascribed honor in this society, in our culture today, just the same way that they did in the New Testament world. We still have this idea of acquired honor. Going again to hash out this political season, Donald Trump's big mouth that it just shocks everyone, or should shock everyone. And, not saying good or bad, but I think maybe what's most shocking about Donald Trump is not what he's saying, but the fact that he even says it, and that he says it so publicly is what shocks people. The public spectacle of a public challenge, in the first century, these challenges were done in the open because you needed an audience. Remember I told you about how, like, the public square was where you challenged people to gain honor? Well, that was important because you needed an audience, because the audience judged who did a good job in that challenge and conflict and who didn't do a good job. And it was the public, the rest of the audience that was watching, that would ascribe honor to the winner and consequently not honor to the loser. And these things happen in the city gate, they happen in the marketplace, the synagogue, and the temple. Oh, we've got a guest. This is Brian. Say hi to Periscope, Brian.
Hello.
Brian is the guy who's going to be speaking at our retreat all this weekend. He's a Tennessee fan. I'll give you all a moment to deal with that. If you're a Tennessee fan, you can go Big Orange. If you're not, you can say things to him. But anyway, but if you don't, I'm going to get back to this lesson. I'm not trying to ignore you. So, I'm really late in posting it.
I'm going to go I'll go look over my stuff.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So anyway, to get acquired honor from people, you have to pretty much do something in the public sphere of things that makes other people say, well, that other person's goofy, but that person's pretty cool. In the first century, that happened at the city gate, it happened in the market, it happened in the synagogue or the temple. And that was where it happened. Molina describes it like this. He says, the perception of the message by both individuals to whom it is directed and the public at large, right? So the evaluation of the reaction is on the part of the public is what gives people the honor or takes the honor away. How is that different from what we have today? How is that different from our culture? I don't know that it really is. We have this thing, once again, called social media. I'm on it right now. You're watching it. Social media and the rise of the trolls, right? So now we prefer, rather than going to the marketplace and hashing it out with a big audience, we prefer to hide behind our avatars, our digital personas, and and our emoticons and our emojis, and we like to hide behind all those and cast aspersions on the dignity of our opponents, and then we check back frequently to see if we've gotten any new likes, right? That's what happens on Facebook. It's what happens on Twitter. Oh, and don't even get me started on something like Yik Yak. The cowardice of Yik Yak. It's like the 21st century version of trashing somebody on a restroom wall. It's just obscene. Even Instagram, Instagram this week released news that they are including a software, an algorithm in their software that will allow you to block certain words that you find offensive, so that if anybody tries to comment on a picture or post on your picture with those words, it'll be automatically blocked. I don't know if it blocks it from other people's pictures from your feed or not, but because we can't deal, right? We live in a culture where the appearance of good, right, simply looking good, is of paramount value and virtue. You can't afford to let anyone get too far ahead of you. You definitely don't want to risk your hard-won FaceTime and have it be sullied by something so stupid, right, as sitting at the wrong table, and God forbid, with the wrong people, right? So that brings us to the next section, this which is kind of covers chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, if you read through that chapter. Minor heads it up with this title, Your Sins Are Forgiven. I like to use this title, I'll see your ascribed honor and raise you one paralytic. So we talk about honor. The opposite of honor, this is the idea, this shame of sin. In Jesus' time, sin was seen, illness was seen as a manifestation of sin. So there was this shame associated with disease. Minor points out that the verb used here in Mark implies that the paralytic man is being forgiven even as he is still paralyzed. And that raises the question for people at that time, and should raise for us as well, how can this be? If all their assumptions are correct, how can he be forgiven of sins while he is still sick? Besides that, who does this Jesus guy think he is in forgiving sins? Sorry, I got a low power mode alert. The question the Pharisees basically have is, who died and made him God? Good question. So to deal with this, they challenge his honor and his authority. Right, if you have authority, if you have real authority, it doesn't really matter what you say, right? Jesus says, well, which is easier for the human one in the contemporary English Bible, or most times we see the Son of Man used. Which is easier for the Son of Man or the human one to say, your sins are forgiven, or take up your mat and walk? Well, to answer that question again, right, of who died and made him the forgiver of sins, and this idea of, if you have real authority, it doesn't matter what you say. Well, so who ascribed honor to Jesus? If you're going to go under this ascribed honor, where somebody more powerful ascribes power to you. Well, you remember that thing last week where Jesus got baptized and the heavens were opened and you heard a voice, or Jesus heard a voice from heaven that said, "You are my Son in whom I am well pleased"? That's ascribed power. Pretty important ascribed power. This is to say that Jesus' honor lies outside of the realm, the normal system of the world that he was living in and working in. It was outside of that normal system of honor and authority. This is like after he heals the demon-possessed person in the synagogue that we read last week. The crowd watching says, "What is this new teaching that with honor? I mean, with not with honor, with power and authority?" They're questioning the whole system that they've grown up in, that they've learned to perceive as right. Brings us to another. The next section is talks about eating with tax collectors and sinners. That's 2:13 through 17. I like to use the title, "Oh, I'm sorry. While you were trying to acquire my honor, I shared it with them. What a shame." So anyway, Minor points out that meals and who was on the guest list was a very important thing. Once again, not necessarily very different today, although we seem like we're more laid back about it. So just like in high school, and even, sadly enough, I think even for a lot of people in college, it mattered who you sat with. It's all about sitting with the cool kids, the imputation of coolness, having coolness ascribed to you by sitting at the cool table. So the Pharisees, or as the CEB, the Contemporary English Bible says, the legal experts, they ask why Jesus is sitting with basically the losers. The CEB doesn't say losers, but I'm paraphrasing. It's the Message, Keith Moore edition. So the other end of that question may be, why aren't you sitting with us? They're upset because Jesus is sitting with all these perceived losers. But I think the part that they don't want to say is they've kind of got their feelings all in a twist, and they can't understand why this person who the whole crowd loves and adores, remember the importance of the audience's opinion, the public loves him, but he's sitting with all these people and not with them. The text leads me to suspect this is that they were not invited to the meal, that they were outside watching. They were on the outside looking in, which was probably a first for many of them. So Jesus' response to the question by saying that who he is and what he has is not for them. Goes on to the next section where it talks about the idea of fasting. There's no fasting while the bridegroom is present. That's chapter 2, 18 through 22. I'm not even going to try to do my impersonation, but that great line from A Few Good Men, "You can't handle the truth." I think that's really apropos for this text. The idea that's represented in 2:17 gets expanded in 2:18 through 21. It's not just that this message, this presence, isn't meant for them. They literally can't handle it. And he gives us this weird kind of cryptic story about wineskins and new wine and old wineskins. You may or may not know much about the wine production process. There's a good chance you may have a friend that's into home brewing. And I don't know if you do, next time they set up to brew and they get all their mash and their wort and everything ready and working, check out their setup. They're probably going to have a container that's got a little kind of gooseneck shaped vial on it with like a bubble in it that's got water in it. And if you watch that over the days while the beer's fermenting, you'll see bubbles going through it. That's a really important piece of equipment. I remember when I was growing up, I had a friend, family friend that his whole family, I really stink at this sometimes. Anyway, I had a family friend, he was Jewish, and his parents would make wine every year. And it was kind of neat because you'd go in their house when they would, especially when they were in the process, and it would just smell like Welch's grape juice just exploded everywhere, because they would buy all these grapes and they would mash them up and they would let them sit in these big, huge garbage cans basically to start the process of fermenting. And then they would transfer all that into these glass 5-gallon jugs, like people used to get water in, right? Like we get water in 5-gallon bottles now. These were glass. And then they would put a stopper in the top that was one of those goosenecks. And the reason they would do that is because as things ferment, the process creates gas, and the gas builds up, and if you don't have that little release, that way for the CO2 to get out, it'll explode. It'll just go everywhere, and you waste everything. So if people that are home brewing, they've got to have one of those. If you're making your own wine at home, you've got to have one of those. Well, in the first century, they did all this in skins, right? They would take an animal skin. It must have given it a great bouquet. But they would take an animal skin, they'd sew it up, seal it up, and they would put all the grape juice in there, the pressed grapes, and then they would seal it up and let it ferment, let it do its thing. Well, they didn't need to have a bubbler, because guess what? That skin could stretch over time and allow the gas a place to go, so it wouldn't explode. But here's the thing. Once you've already run one batch of wine through that, and that skin is stretched out as possibly as far as it could go, if you then try to use it a second time with a fresh batch of wine that's still going to ferment, it has no place to go. It can't expand anymore. It just has no room for this new wine, and it's going to rupture, and then everything's wasted. The skin is gone, the wine is gone. So it's not just that these people aren't, like, that he's saying this message is, it's not just that it's not really meant for you, it's just you can't handle it. Like, it will literally blow your mind. So that leads us on to chapter 2, 23 through 28, the Sabbath, and who was the Sabbath made for? The Sabbath was made for mankind. It brings to light, going back to what we talked about in the beginning when we were talking about Molina's book, the problem with a limited good society, with the idea of limited good and limited honor and limited power. You remember the pyramid that we showed last week? See if I can find it real quick. Remember how we talked about last week that the world kind of, in Jesus' time, kind of operated like that? All the people like Caesar with all the real power were at the top, and everybody else was at the bottom, and everything kind of flowed uphill. Well, let's expand on that a little bit. So, if I had to draw out a limited good society, kind of using that pyramid scheme, you've got this closed system, right? And at the top you've got more, and at the bottom you've got less, right? So you have ascribed honor, which filters down from the top. And as it gets farther and farther down, it gets distributed between more and more people, and it gets less and less and less. the other side, you've got the ascribed honor, which is going to tend to flow uphill. And matter of fact, it's kind of a loop, because the people on the top, at some point, they're getting it this way, and then they're redistributing it down. So you get this closed circle and this closed system, and everybody's fighting and scratching for this little bit that they perceive is available to them. And that's a problem. So ascribed honor is divided downward. Acquisition is gathered upward, and maybe, then laterally, like Melina said, it's also in between peers. They take honor from each other. But it's a closed system, and everything and everyone becomes a means to an end. When you're in a closed system like that, and the only good you see is kind of what you can get for yourself, then everybody else around you just becomes a means to an end. And that end is acquiring good for yourself. It's, okay, let's use a Star Trek reference, because last week was the anniversary of Star Trek. The Ferengi rules of acquisition. Go back and watch Deep Space Nine and get into some of that, and you'll be like, wow, it's like they were talking about us. So, you got to ask then, in this kind of culture, where there's only so much to go around, and then when you think that way, everybody around you is just a means to an end, and the end is you acquiring more good for yourself. Let's talk about the Sabbath. What does that do to the Sabbath? What good is the Sabbath? What's the good of the Sabbath? Well, let's talk about what the Sabbath is. First of all, it was a day ordained by God for the good of people. We see that in Genesis, when God talks about the seventh day, and he's resting, right? On the seventh day, God rested. In Deuteronomy, it becomes an ordinance. It becomes part of the law. So you got to ask the question, why? What's the point? One of the best explanations I've read about really the idea of Sabbath, and they're not necessarily talking about Sabbath, but they are talking about Sabbath, is by a guy named Joseph Pieper. I always want to call him Piper. So there's another Piper out there, but you'd probably be better off reading this Joseph Pieper than that Piper. It's just meant to be. Anyway, so this book, Leisure and the Basis of Culture, he talks about the idea of festival, right? And the idea of leisure. And I'm going to give you some quotes from him. He says, "The festival is the origin of leisure, and the inward and ever-present meaning of leisure. And because leisure is thus by its nature a celebration, it is more than effortless. It is the direct opposite of effort." He goes on to say, "In leisure, man too celebrates the end of his work by allowing his inner eye to dwell for a while upon the reality of the creation. He looks and affirms. He says it is good." Does this sound familiar? That's what's going on in Genesis when God takes this day of leisure at the end of his labors to just sit back and take it all in and enjoy and participate in the goodness that he's created. It's God on the seventh day. That's it. He's having his own little festival. The Sabbath allows us to join God in reflection on what is truly good. It allows us to just enjoy that. It provides us with the opportunity to be with the one who truly is good. It allows us to think about the good and our good, right? So Pieper goes on to say that in this way, the Sabbath is not merely a pause for the sake of going back to work. And unfortunately, that's a lot of the ways that people think about the Sabbath. It's like, oh, it's our day off, so we can go back and work on Monday. Pieper says that the Sabbath, like this idea of festival, it runs at right angles to the idea of work. In other words, he says, it stands opposed to the exclusive ideal of work as a social function. And let's think about that. If you're going to talk about how people ascribe honor to people, in our culture, it seems to be about who can work harder and who can work longer and who can give themselves an ulcer and who can die young, and for what? Go when you get off of here, get done watching this, go dig up Billy Joel's Only the Good Die Young. Even better than that one, that one's kind of questionable for this, but listen to Moving Out. Anthony's song. It's good. I think he read Peeper. Anyway, by spending time with Jesus, because the next thing that happens in Mark is you get Jesus and his disciples moving through a grain field on the Sabbath, and his disciples are hungry, so they start picking heads of grain and chewing on the wheat, and they get chastised, and Jesus gets his honor challenged because his disciples are working on the Sabbath, right? The interesting thing is that by spending time with Jesus and enjoying his goodness and the goodness of the grain provided by God's good creation, the disciples in that moment, they probably had a better handle on the Sabbath than did the Pharisees with all of their hardships. It's questionable whether with all of their self-imposed hardships they were doing anything to honor God. So let's talk about the Sabbath. Let's put the Sabbath in its place. You got Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for the good of the people. The people were not made for the good of the Sabbath. You've got Wesley talks about ordinances like Sabbath observance and how important they are. He says, the observing the ordinances of God, something like Sabbath, is really important as long as you remember why it's important, right? John Wesley's Sermon 16, The Means of Grace. He says, you have gone away from, quotes actually, Malachi 3:7, and that's a really important book. It's one of the minor prophets, and you should probably read it because it does a good job of explaining how you can observe all the law, you can observe all the ordinances, you can do all the right things and still do them for all the wrong reasons, and do them in such a way that God no longer cares. But the quote from the scripture from Malachi that Wesley begins this sermon on means of grace with is Malachi 3:7. Ye have gone away from mine ordinances and have not kept them. Wesley had the King James. That's what he had. Anyway, the point of this is it's possible to observe all the ordinances of God, keeping the letter of the law, and yet completely miss the point. So the Sabbath in Wesley's thought, he talks about it as a means of grace. What does that mean? He says it is a way in which we experience God's presence with us and his love for us. And if we forget this, if we forget that any of these things are that are a means of grace, or the way that we experience God's presence and God's love, if we forget this, we've missed the point. Direct quote from Wesley, he says, but we allow that the whole value of the means depends on their actual subservience to the end of religion. There's that word people don't like again, religion. That consequently all these means, when separate from the end, are less than nothing and vanity. That if they do not actually conduce to the knowledge and love of God, they are not acceptable in his sight. He says, Yea, rather, they are an abomination before him, a stink in his nostrils. He is weary to bear them. He gets really mad. He goes on to say, it's not easy to find words for the enormous folly and wickedness of thus turning God's arms against himself, of keeping Christianity out of the heart by those very means which were ordained for bringing it in. In other words, the Sabbath and all those other things created for the blessing of humanity are means to an end. The end is bringing God and people closer together. It isn't the end in itself. So that brings us to the question, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? We get these lawyers that are hanging out and being stinky in God's nostrils. As Wesley said, they were confusing the means with the end, and that does terrible things. The end is the love of God shed abroad in our hearts, right? That's how Wesley puts it. And how's that for a metric? I'm not sure where that goes in the year-end statistics or a spreadsheet. It's our end is in God's goodness. That's what this is all about. The Sabbath is a means to that end. When we make the means the end in itself, the whole order of things gets stood up on its head. People are no longer good. They just become a means to some other good. The Sabbath, like in Jesus' case, the people were just a means to the good of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was no longer a means to the good for the people. The worship service can just become a means, an end in itself, and then all the people who are coming are just really a means to keep that perceived good going. Whole denominations can become just a perceived good in themselves. Like then the people that are in that denomination, it's questionable whether or not they're really cared for as a good and valued as a good. They're just a means to an end, for that denomination's survival. The Pharisees had become so blind to what was really good that they couldn't even see what was going on. They were so caught up in defending their own honor and their own little brown, burned-up patch of soil that they were willing to use a man who could ill afford to be used. They bring in this guy who's got a withered hand and try to entrap Jesus into doing work on the Sabbath. So they use him as a means to dishonor Jesus and consolidate their own power and honor. They didn't care about the man. They didn't really care about the Sabbath. And if they did, they would have found a way to honor both of them. So if we shouldn't be surprised at the end of the day when they reject the honor of Jesus' presence, and pursue friendship with Herod. So Mitzi Minor asked this great question: what's up with the religious leaders? They have lost sight of the point because they're so invested in the old model and the old way of doing things. They're too busy running around trying to grab what few scraps they could find. And even our own religious leaders, we can fall into this trap. It's easy for us to get caught up in our own little limited good, that we forget that numbers represent real people with real lives and people with real worth. And this brings into question when we do that, when we forget that in itself brings into question any of the real good that we might do. So the sad thing is that, this is John Wesley, life coach. Well, sometimes the best life coach tells you stories about how they messed up. So I'm going to tell you about John Wesley. You thought I was going to tell you about how I messed up. Funny. Anyway, Wesley, there's this girl named Sophie, this issue of an open table or closed table. Well, John Wesley made a pretty bad mistake. He forgot the point of the table, in this instance the communion table, and he refused communion on the Sabbath, on Sunday, to a woman by the name of Sophie Hopke, and it was because he felt he had been slighted by her. See, you got to understand that John Wesley desperately wanted to have a woman in his life, but as I like to say to my friend Brian that you saw earlier, John Wesley desperately wanted a woman in his life. Whenever he got one, he wasn't sure what the heck to do then. And so he was so kind of nervous about it that happens while he's a chaplain in Savannah, Georgia, under General Oglethorpe. He drags his feet and is so timid that the girl just figures he's not interested, and she takes the invitation of another young man. Well, Wesley finds out about this, feels slighted, and she shows up for church one Sunday morning and comes up to receive the sacrament, and he refuses her the sacrament. Now, Wesley trots out that this kind of obscure point of Anglican canon law and says that, well, she didn't inform him that she was going to be present, so he couldn't, she didn't do the right thing, so he didn't give her communion. It didn't work out so well. Wesley ends up having to flee the Georgia colony. And on the way back to England, he kind of has this come-to-meeting moment. Let's say come-to-Jesus moment. And actually, he has several come-to-Jesus moments throughout his career. But it's a long road home for him. And the result of that is, I think Wesley gets his paradigm shifted and ends up spending the rest of his life building a movement that would make sure that the people who really needed it the most had a place at the table. Wesley abandoned the old model of this limited good for Jesus' model of a limitless God, and that's pretty important. So we talked about that pyramid, the pyramid scheme here. If I can find it, it's a lot of pages, where we're in this kind of limited little circle, and there's only so much of everything to go around, and especially something like honor. You can either have it ascribed to you which means it gets a little less and less and less the further it trickles down. Trickle down theory. Or you can have it, you can acquire it by taking it from other people around you, and then it just keeps going up and up and just basically circles back around. It's this limited good. It's a closed system. There's only so much there. There's nothing else coming in. Well, Jesus kind of takes that and turns it on its head. And so now things look like this, because Jesus is giving to everybody, but he's receiving it from his heavenly Father. So, hey, I'm on Periscope. So anyway, people love to talk to me while I'm on Periscope. It's awesome. Let me introduce, I've run out of battery too. This is Nathan.
Hey.
Are you on camera? He's doing the music for this week, and he's pretty awesome. I'll tell you about his band later. Anyway, for next week, you got to read Mark 3:7 through 4:34. I want you to think about these questions. Have you ever been tempted to demonize someone who took a controversial stand or a knee? What do you hear this passage that you're reading in Mark 3:7 through 4:34 saying about a temptation like that? Can you think of a time when you began to see the world or even yourself differently than you had before? And do you or did you see God at work in the change you experienced? So anyway, thank you. I would spend some more time talking to you and bringing you up to date about stuff, but I think I'm about to have a dead battery. So anyway, once again, if you know what this is all about on my hat, feel free to send me a message with what you think the answer is. You can comment, and then if you get it right, we'll get in touch with you and send you a Wesley t-shirt. Thank you.